My name is Drew Waldron, and I am on with disability advocate, educator, and best-selling author Rebekah Taussig. Rebekah, how are you this morning?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Fantastic. Really excited to get into this conversation. How do you introduce yourself and your career to someone who might be unfamiliar with your work?
To be honest, I normally ramble quite a bit. It used to be so much simpler when I was a teacher and I could just say I'm a teacher and that meant something to people. And these days I do so many different things. I'm really lucky to be able to do so many different things. But at the heart of it, I'm a writer. So I usually introduce myself with that kind of core word as the work that I do. And as a writer, I'm really interested in storytelling, but I mean that in a really expansive way. I kind of see human beings as all storytellers living on a planet made of stories. And I see stories all around us, the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves, the stories we imagine on other people, the stories that we kind of tell collectively as a culture. And in that storytelling, I'm most interested in the connection between those stories that we tell and our lived world, or our built world, our lived experience in that world, like the bridge between those two things. Because I think that the stories that we tell inform that world, right? Like the stories we tell shape our relationships, they shape our families, they shape our communities and the way we build cities. And so I'm really interested in becoming more aware of the stories that we're already telling, but also thinking through ways and places and that we can tell new stories. And in telling new stories, kind of build a different world. So that's my little spiel. That's replacing I'm a teacher. I'm a storyteller. I'm a writer. And I think about all of these things like every day.
It seems like you've had a connection with storytellers and stories from a very young age. What were some very impactful or inspiring works that kind of led you to your career in writing today?
Oh, that's a great question. Like things that like sparked that interest in
Oh,
me.
absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I think as a really young kid, I was an avid reader and I would read a lot of books over and over and over again. So for me, that was like Roald Dahl, Lingle, I think is her name. That would be like A Wrinkle in Time and like all of these really imaginative, like the Chronicles of Narnia books, all of these almost like world building creative spaces. Which is interesting that you're asking me that because I haven't talked about those books in a long time. I do think that like space for imagination and seeing writing as a way of building worlds is kind of how I still think about that. Like, we're not like building Narnia, but like thinking about storytelling as a way as a tool for imagination. And I think that I see it that way still as like the way we tell stories, the characters we build in those stories, how we think about those characters shapes the actual world that we live in and how we look at people and work with people and build with people. So yeah, I read a lot of really imaginative, playful stories as a kid and started writing myself pretty early too. I mean, that's definitely something that's developed over the long arc and especially the kind of writing that I do now. But writing has always been like my brain and my heart. It's how I think, it's how I move through the world and connect with the world. So
Yeah,
yeah.
that's very well said. From writer to educator and now to speaker. In your speaking career, you've been a massive advocate to those living with all forms of different disabilities. What topics do you find yourself speaking on the most in your work as an advocate for people living with disabilities?
Yeah, okay, so I'll try not to talk for like the rest of the day about this. It's true. This is a big question. I mean, we talk about a lot of different things. I mean, I think a lot of what I do is even just talking about disability 101, right? Like let's look at this word, disability, and think about what that word really means, how we've understood it historically, how we understand it now. I think a lot of people come to a talk about disability thinking that the experience of disability is somehow like really exceptional and often tragic, kind of like a separate human experience, when disability is actually very common and often really ordinary. Disability is like just another dot on the spectrum of human expression and experience in the world. So I try to reframe how we think about and talk about disability, which means we also talk about ableism a lot. And so thinking about how we define ableism, what that looks like in the real world. I describe and define ableism as a story that we tell about the human body and mind that has really deep roots that we have kind of continued to hold up as objective truth. And they're actually not objective truth, right? They're storytelling and those stories can change. Ableism is telling a story that always puts the disabled body and mind on the margins. limitations. 2023, human beings have a lot of really punishing myths about what it means to live in a human body. We've kind of created these systems that force us to sort of like push our bodies beyond their limits, right? Like we're not allowed to age. We're doing everything we can possibly do to not enter into the very inevitable and ordinary process of aging. And we're always pushing ourselves to do more and do faster. And our bodies aren't allowed to have needs. And so a lot of what I talk about with people is looking at disability as one part of a very ordinary human experience. Like if we live long enough, all of us will experience some kind of disability. And that's like not a threat. That's just sort of a friendly return to the ordinary experience of a human body. So these are some of the things that we talk about. I think of disability as such an exciting disruptor of a lot of the systems that we have, a lot of the punishing systems that we have maintained and continue to have. And so thinking about disability as like this prompt for imagination, like how else could we build these systems and spaces to hold all of us better? So I talk with a lot of university students and talk with like more corporate audiences about how to build inclusive workspaces, medical professionals about like creating more meaningful experiences with patients and medical providers and all kinds of people. But I think at the heart of it, it's really thinking about disability in a different way and working together to kind of tell a different story about disability and build a world that holds all of us better.
Wow, you went into a tangent there that I would love to ask you a big question about. Not sure if I have an answer for this, but this is a big question.
Yeah.
Where do you think those self-created myths come from? Like on a societal, sociological level, where does a human fear of aging come from? Where does the projection to defend against it come from?
Yeah, well, I mean, like we could get into this, Drew. I mean, there's a lot to unpack here, right? And it's not like I'm the source of the answers of why humans are afraid of dying, but from my perspective and a lot of the work that I've done and looking at like storytelling and the ways that we've told the story of the human experience over time, and I think there's a couple of things I would point to. I mean, I think one thing is just looking at human history. I think the Industrial Revolution is a big part of our inheritance of the world we live in now, right? Like this shift towards standardizing machines and starting to think about human beings as cogs in machines, that they're like replicable, right? Like there's an ideal body that's supposed to look like this and it operates this way, and let's calculate the average for that human body. In the scope of human history, we really have kind of built up this actual myth that there is an average human body and that it looks and moves and operates this way. And then we build classrooms around that idea of that average student, and we build workspaces around the idea of that average worker, and that is a myth. Human beings, like if you actually look at how many human beings would fit into that average student or that average worker, it's incredibly and shockingly low, because human beings are so vibrant in their varieties, right? We have so many different ways of thinking and learning and working and being in the world. And so I think that is a big part of the tension that we're in now, is that we built this world as if that average person is a real person. And I guess there are a few of them, but actually by and large, most of us don't fit into that template. So I think that's part of it, if that answers at least some of your question.
Oh, absolutely.
In terms of this like fear of aging, I think that makes a lot of sense, right? Like of all of the things that we fear as human beings, end of life is the backdrop of all of that, right? And grappling with some of these really impossible emotions about the finality of that and losing each other. I mean, like that's the core of what makes life hard. And I think that as human beings, we just, and I don't know, like that's not something that I have done a lot of research in, like how human beings have thought of death over human history. But I think the culture that we live in right now really doesn't spend a lot of time trying to grapple with that. I think we spend a lot of time in denial about death. And part of that is like not the way that we handle aging and like our old people. The way that we have built our communities is that when you get to a certain age, you can't live with your families anymore, and we're going to send you to a different home. And that's a whole complicated system. But I think part of that is that we're not even near death a lot of times, that we sort of remove ourselves from that process. There's a lot that could be said about that. And I don't know how much of that is relevant for this conversation, but it's interesting. It's really interesting to me. And I think it's important. And I think it's important that we grapple with that. And I think that disability in a lot of ways, like at its core, I think part of it is that confrontation of like not being able to ignore the human body, because the difference and the need of that human body is in the forefront in a lot of ways, depending on that disability. So yeah, it's really interesting. I don't want to like ramble into the afternoon, but I love that question.
Oh, absolutely. That was a very articulate response to what might have been the biggest question I could have asked.
Yeah, it's It's interesting. It's a lot to think about, and it's important. So thanks for asking it.
No, absolutely. If we could get back to talking about your work as an advocate for those living with disabilities, there's one thing that I've heard you speak about a couple times, which really shocks me, and that's the extent to which some U.S. laws allow parents with disabilities to lose custody of their children under different varying circumstances. What do you think the average person should know about these laws that they may not be familiar with?
Yeah, the laws are interesting, and actually, I didn't know about the situation with those laws until after I became a parent, which was really shocking to me as well, and kind of horrifying. And it's not just the laws. I mean, it's also looking at like the rate at which parents with disabilities lose custody of their children. It's very disproportionate, and so yeah, there's a few things we could think about there. I mean, I think non-disabled parents are scrutinized in a different way from non-disabled parents. While it's often assumed for non-disabled people that they will have children or want to have children, that's kind of like a default assumption. It's also assumed that disabled people will not become parents or don't plan to become parents. And unlike their non-disabled counterparts, disabled parents kind of come to the game with a lot to prove, almost like they have to prove that they deserve to be trusted to be parents. I think that the laws that you mentioned, Drew, are really kind of just tangible examples of ableism, really tangible examples, high stakes examples of ableism, because ableism tells a story. It holds up this fictitious belief that a disability can only ever be a deficit. It's only a lack of something. And so a parent with a disability is only a lesser parent. Like that's the equation that ableism would have us believe. And in my experience as a parent, so I have a 3-year-old son. He's 3 years old now. And in my experience of parenting is, of course, like so much more complicated and richer and fuller than that equation of parenting. And so I guess what I would want people to know is, first of all, just be aware of that extra layer of scrutiny that disabled parents have, and be mindful of that in kind of the way that they interact with parents, particularly parents with disabilities. But also what I would just want to speak to here is that I have been shocked and surprised by how much parenting reminds me of my experience with disability, and that in that way I felt uniquely prepared for parenting in a way that I don't think I would have been had I not experienced disability over the course of my lifetime, which is counterintuitive. Like, we don't think about disability and parenting as overlapping in that way. We often think of them as like very opposite experiences. But I found that disability almost felt like a training camp for me in parenting. Like, disability over a lifetime has been like this boot camp for learning how to be adaptable, how to be flexible, how to be ready to pivot at any moment, how to like creative problem solving skills. I have this very high tolerance for knowing what I can and cannot control. So I have kind of like this endless well of patience that I get to bring into parenting that I think is a tool, an asset to me as a parent. I also feel like disability it kind of forces me on occasion to actually be the parent that I intend to be or want to be, like my ideals as a parent. So I want to be a parent that is always pursuing connection with my son. That I would much rather us move through the world connected than me like forcing you to always do the things I want you to do. I want to be connected to you, and I want us to move through and collaborate and do those things together. And disability really pushes me in that direction over and over and over again. It pushes me to move slow with my son. And like, I want to be the parent that stops to like watch the ants like pick up the tiny speck of food and carry it over to the little tiny divot in the road. And like, this is what we did last night. We like stared at the road and the ants and we took like 2 minutes to just sit and stare at that sidewalk. And I feel like disability is pushing me towards being that parent, and that's the parent that I want to be. So I guess what I would say is being aware that there is a default skepticism of disabled parents, and that when disabled parents are doing things that look unfamiliar, look more elaborate, or look different than what you usually see parents doing, take a beat and like witness the wonder of that, right? Like, disabled parents are creative. They do things differently. And that's actually like an asset and something to support and cherish and learn from, as opposed to meet with skepticism. And we could talk about examples. I don't know how helpful and how much you want to spend on this, on talking about this, but that's kind of my general spiel about disability and parenting, is that disabled parents don't need skepticism. They need support just like any other parent needs support. Every single parent on this planet has their own unique set of limitations. Disabled parents sometimes might be more visible or might look different than what you expect, but all parents have limitations and all parents need support in those limitations. And that's not different for disabled parents. The same.
Absolutely. I think that that overlap and your ability to convey your experience is what has connected a lot of fans with your work. And one of the best ways that you communicate to fans of your work is through your social media. Now, you have over 62,000 followers on your Instagram account, which is Sitting Pretty, which you create personal mini memoirs. What has it been like navigating the social media world as you've gained more and more attention from people who connect with your personal story?
Yeah, it's strange. It's been a ride. I mean, like I've had that account for almost, I think like 8 years now. I think it's been about 8 years. And yes, that account has grown a lot in 8 years. And all social media and Instagram as a space has changed a lot in those years.
Absolutely.
Right? I mean, like, it's a whole other landscape in a lot of ways. And when I started that account, it was very important to me. Like, one of my main goals was human connection. So I felt really alone in my experience of disability in that space. It became this space of like really deep and authentic connection with other people. And maintaining that space as an authentic, genuine, true space has felt really important to me, like more important to me than almost anything in my priorities on my social media presence. Like, I want that space to be genuine. And so there's not a single thing that I will post in that space, stories, reels, posts, whatever. There's not a single thing that goes into that space that I don't feel truly connected to. And that has been something that I feel very strongly about, and like kind of unwaveringly as it has gotten bigger, I have felt more and more that has been a bigger and bigger priority to me. Because I think that as it gets bigger, there's like pressures that would turn into something else, that there would be pressure for it to post things that I think people expect me to post, or at a speed that I think the algorithm encourages, right? So for good or bad, I don't know what that space would be like otherwise. It might be a lot bigger, it might be smaller, I don't know. For good or bad, I just like I cannot make myself play the game of the algorithm. Like, I can't stomach it. So what that means is that there will be long stretches where I will not post anything at all. And I know that that's not how you're supposed to do it. It's just such a high priority to me that whatever would show up in that space, that I would feel connected to it, that it would feel meaningful and true and genuine, and not just like a hot take of the moment. I mean, if it happens to be great, but otherwise it's more about that North Star of how can I bear witness to what is true and my actual experience in the world.
Absolutely.
So I've been really pleased, I will say, for like how it has changed as it's gotten bigger, but I've been very, very pleased by the people that seem to show up in that space. They're some of the loveliest humans, and I'm like knocking on wood. Tomorrow it could change, but it's been it has continued to be a really beautiful community, and I feel very lucky about that. But I also wonder and hope that maybe part of that is because it has been such a high priority for me to make that space just about genuine human stories and connection with other humans. That's always been my priority. The day that I feel unable to do that anymore is probably the day that it's done, because that's kind of what it's been about for me.
Absolutely. On your social media, authenticity definitely takes precedent, where with any other artist, it's just a picture, maybe a one sentence caption, but your social media content is so deeply personal. And I wanted to ask, do you find it difficult to articulately share that much about yourself with the world on a fairly consistent basis? Or is that openness something that just comes naturally to you?
Yeah, you maybe have picked up on, I don't know. I'm kind of an oversharer by nature. I have
Nothing wrong with that.
Or I should say, like, I have a very high threshold for what makes me feel genuinely vulnerable. And who knows why. But a lot of the things that I share in that space, you're right, a lot of the things I share might be vulnerable for other people to share, or might be viewed as like deeply personal. And of course, like, I am a human being like any other. Like, there are parts of my story, there are memories, there are topics that I do feel really vulnerable about. But I don't publish anything on my social media and in like an essay in my book. I don't publish anything that I feel genuinely wobbly about, or that I don't feel safe bringing into public spaces. Like, everything that I write, I read like 6,000 times. There's like not a single word or comma that hasn't been turned over and considered. And so everything that's there, it is deeply personal, but I also feel ready to share it. I would say that one thing that has complicated this entire thing of like oversharing and having a high threshold for what I feel comfortable sharing is my son. Since becoming a parent, he's not old enough to give me consent about what I share. And a lot of my life is him right now, right? Like he's 3. So a lot of my life is parenting. And so I've had to be really intentional about how to share that experience in a way that I feel like protects him. And I'm like figuring it out in real time. It's really important to me that I never tell his story for him, like he's the only one who can tell his story or his experience. But it also feels important to me to write about disabled parenting. And so threading that needle can be tricky. I am just trying to be really careful about when I write about parenting, I'm writing about my experience as a parent and protecting him and honoring his own story that I hope he will one day grow up to be able and want to tell, not to a large audience unless he wants to, but just like for himself to know what that story is. That's complicated, but yeah. I have a very high threshold. I am comfortable sharing a lot.
Absolutely. I hope that eventually his audiences are as large as yours.
Well, if he wants, we'll see.
If he wants.
Pros and cons.
And on the subject of your speaking career, this will be our final question. What are some of your favorite groups to speak with or your favorite topics to speak about?
Yeah, when I think about like communities and groups that I just like leave feeling full and glowing and excited about whatever we talked about, I mean, I'm thinking about people that are genuinely curious. I really like talking with groups of people who invested in building genuinely safe, kind, inclusive, accessible communities and spaces. People who are curious about how to really do that. And I love talking with people who know that there are like a million different ways that we could do this and who feel excited about the idea of change and problem solving and who like want to get in there and figure out and build differently and find different ways to organize or build systems. I love talking with parents. I love talking with people who are trying to figure out how to show up as parents. And I love talking with folks with all kinds of disabilities. I love talking with people who are trying to figure out how to live in a human body in this world that we have built. So yeah, I don't know. I love talking with people, Drew. I really enjoy what I get to do when I get to meet different groups of people and connect with them. It's actually, I feel really lucky that I get to do this.
That is a fantastic answer. Rebekah, that is going to conclude our interview. I want to thank you again for your time. This has been fantastic.
Yeah, I had a good time. Thanks for your great questions.
Absolutely. Take care, everybody.